Riot Games have messed up. They've given into a vocal minority of players who misunderstood a champion so much that they demanded changes that only made their worst complaints more true. Changes so counter to the primary design goals of the champion that they forced her into not only an incredibly low win rate, but worse, into being far more boring than originally intended. She is so much a shadow of her former self that I can't help but ask questions about how some of these changes got approved in the first place. Over a year, I've been preaching these failures to my friends and fellow players, so I figured, why not get these thoughts out to others so that they too can understand the plight of my favorite champion, Yuumi. Yuumi was one of the most individual, compelling, and unique champions in the game on her release, and I loved to play her. No other champion played the same way or had the same control over fights that Yuumi did, and she instantly became one of my most played, and by far one of my most favorite. That's why it pained me so much to see the community's reaction to her design in the weeks and months following her release. Players constantly misassessed her strengths, complained about parts of her kit, and suggested changes that were counterintuitive to her design. The thing that I hated the most at the time was one of the things that I believe most influenced the meme culture that kind of started to surround her balance. The one player, two champions videos, or the countless variants of them that were made at the time. They were created solely with the intention of highlighting the least favorable parts of her design, preying on community sentiment around her by cherry-picking examples to reinforce misconceptions. They created this social bubble of players who didn't quite understand Yuumi's kit enough to criticize it meaningfully, but would rely on the memes to make her look bad. Riot's reaction to this type of content is actually the part that shocked me the most, though. Bluntly, Riot's response to the community sentiment that Yuumi was simple and boring to play, with or against, was to add changes to her kit that de-incentivized diverse gameplay, rather pushing her into the most boring playstyles that players complained about so much. Again, to make this staggeringly clear, people thought she was boring and easy, so they made her easier and more boring. As someone who was invested in the balance of such a unique champion at the time, it left me shocked that they chose some of the changes they did, and I intend to show you just how clearly they destroyed her playstyle intentions on release. To do this, I'm going to go through each of Yuumi's spells. First, how they served to support a far more unique and complex playstyle than players gave her credit for, and then again, discussing the changes that Riot made to them and how they ruined them. And finally, with some data just to show off that I'm not, pulling this all out of thin air. Here we go. I'm going to start much like the Champion Spotlight did, with Yuumi's W, You and Me. It's by far one of the most complicated spells in her kit, let alone in the game, when used correctly. At its simplest, and this was the most credit a lot of players gave it, it allowed you to attach to an ally, giving them a small amount of stats and modifying some of your abilities slightly. It also made you untargetable. This was already a widely unique design choice, something no other champion in the game can do. Being able to hide in another champion greatly influenced her build paths and choices, unlike anyone else. For example, most Yuumi players would outright skip boots and flash, for lack of a need of either. This opened up faster rushing of some items, such as Athene's Unholy Grail, which we'll be talking about later, and summoner spell choice, such as Ignite and Exhaust, or taking heal so their ADC could take TP. There was already a lot there, and there's more though. When an additional ally is within a few hundred units of range, she was able to jump to them risk-free, riding with them until she decided to hop off or to a new person. This, notably, had no cooldown, allowing her near unrivaled mobility in fights. It's realizations like this that start to show you that she was significantly more complex than players gave her credit for. Like, who really expects the champion who can't walk to have some of the most teamfight mobility of any champion in the game? Couple this with the rest of her spells as we get to them, and you'll start to really get an understanding of just how powerful and fun she was on release. Next, onto Yuumi's passive, Bop and Block, a fantastic spell with multi-layered design. Once every dozen seconds or so, Yuumi could attack an enemy champion and it would give her back some mana and a little shield. It's important to note that because Yuumi is unable to attack while attached to an ally, she would have to jump off to proc this. Mana regeneration has been a really powerful tool in League of Legends for a while now, particularly in the early game with the lack of mana potions, and so this was a fairly powerful passive to have. But accompany this with the fact that her mana costs were relatively high, and with their spammable nature, she was often mana gated or unable to keep up with the costs, particularly in lane before she got her items. This created a little bit of a back and forth, as she would try and use it as often as possible to keep her mana up without putting herself into situations that were too risky. This was fantastic, not just for Yuumi players to have something to think about, but providing the enemy with opportunities to jump on her too. You see, one of the biggest complaints about Yuumi was that it was super hard to kill her, leaving players really frustrated that they didn't have a chance to catch her out. Bop and Block created the exact opportunities to jump on Yuumi that players were looking for. If you created enough pressure that Yuumi couldn't feel safe using it, she would run out of mana and drop in power. It was a huge source of power for Yuumi, but also a huge source of risk for engagement with the enemy players. Simple and masterful. On to Q, Prowling Projectile. It shoots out a little controllable magic missile that does bonus damage and slows if it's traveled for more than a second before hitting an enemy champion. I see this as Riot trying to ensure that Yuumi players didn't feel out of control while riding on an ally. Due to its slow cooldown, while Yuumi wasn't often moving herself, she could still be doing something. It was a really fun spell to use, particularly in lane, where its slow turn rate and ability to hit minions became this little game of cat and mouse you would play with the enemy laners. They would have to try and dodge it or cut through creeps, while you'd have to try and curve it in interesting ways and use its relatively long duration to try and hit them. This extended into the mid and late game, where it became a powerful chasing tool due to its slow, and you'd have to weave it through the fight to try and slow the people you wanted. You never had no buttons to press as Yuumi, and this spell was a decent contribution to that feeling, always leaving you with, something to be doing while your other spells were on cooldown. Good stuff. Yuumi's E, Zoomies, was one of the biggest ways she could influence fights, and was a considerably large part of why people disliked her so much. Having 2 charges, she could heal and provide some move speed to a target that she was riding on. I firstly want to address the belief that on release this spell had too much healing. Its very first implementation healed for 50 to 130 plus 40% AP at most, which is not that much. With a 14-second base cooldown, this is by no means an insane amount of HP to be pumping out. For some comparison, Soraka W is 100 to 240 plus 70% AP, and Volibear W is 20 to 80 plus 8 to 16% of missing HP. Both of these are bigger numbers. This leaves it comfortably in the zone of what I'd consider pretty good, I guess, but by no means insanely high. What was really providing most of her healing on release was the item she would always rush, Athene's Unholy Grail. Athene's was a really problematic item, which is why it's gone now, providing a flat amount of HP when healing an ally after dealing magic damage to an enemy. At its most, it would provide a 250 flat HP, more than Yuumi's entire heal nearly doubled, and you almost always had full stacks on it by using your Q off cooldown. You've got to understand, you'd be getting this item first, way earlier than you normally would, because you're not getting boots, and long before you're maxing your E, so almost all of your healing was coming out of exclusively this item. There's a reason it was removed in the item rework. There was another item that Yuumi used, and still does today, Ardent Sensor. Ardent has historically been a bit of a problem item, nearly wholly defining the meta for a while, and with Zoomies having 2 charges, and her ability to move rapidly between allies, Yuumi could easily apply this to 2 different allies at once, dramatically buffing those who could use it well. Zoomies was never quite as strong as the items made it feel like it was, but having 2 charges and a baseline heal and that move speed, it became the perfect foundation for much of support itemization. That's what made it so good. That's what made her so good. Lastly is Yuumi's R, Last Chapter, and by far it's her least interesting spell, at least in comparison to her others. It shoots out waves of damage that can root an enemy if it hits them multiple times. With relatively low range, it wasn't a fantastic engage spell, but decent counter engage, where it could help to keep enemies from getting too close to your backline without having to use a big spell or maybe flash. Not really much else to say here. But now we get to move on to the far more exciting part. How they ruined the good parts of all of these! Back to the top again with her W. This spell received some of the most egregious and downright awful changes in her kit, something we will see echoed throughout every other spell as we talk about them. Like I had said before, one of the biggest complaints about Yuumi is that she was easy to play, and so she could literally go AFK and be just as useful as if she was fully engaged. I'll get to how I think this perception of her was formed in a bit, but hopefully having heard the descriptions before this, you'll understand that that was not the case. Now, close your eyes. Imagine what the worst thing you could do to her kit is. Remember, players hate what Yuumi looks and feels AFK, but you have to come up with a balance change for her mobility spell. Would you come up with A, maybe more ways to introduce weakness, such as shared damage? B, reinforce the idea that she can't fight for very long by gating her mana further? C, do nothing because you know the vocal minority is wrong about her balance? Or D, remove as many incentives for her to be as mobile as possible, doubling down on the idea that she should never move? Yep. Riot decided to balance Yuumi by allowing her to be hit by spells while dashing between allies, something that was formerly completely safe, and introduced the grounded status when she was CC'd while off someone. This creates such a massive risk that any usage of W is now very, very unlikely to end well for the Yuumi. Just jumping from one ally to another gives you what feels like a 1 in 10 chance of accidentally getting clipped by CC and being stunned out of it. And because you have the max HP of a wet napkin, you promptly explode before you can wait the whole 6 seconds to remount. They also upped the amount of stats she shares with an ally, de-incentivizing her from riding on tanks rather than people who are building damage items. I know that people didn't like that she was difficult to kill, but near completely removing her ability to move around the fight seems a little bit overkill, doesn't it? They literally took the most hated part of Yuumi and changed her best spell to fit people's worst view of it. She doesn't want to, and barely can anymore, move around fights like she used to, just like all of those memers thought she did on release. And it's hard to put into words how irrationally angry that makes me. Right, okay, on to her passive, which received a change in patch 9.14, and thank God this was reverted after a few months. But I wanted to highlight it anyway because I think it gives a fantastic example of how little Riot understood what they were doing with her when it came to balancing her and making her more healthy. So, you know how I talked about the mana costs being offset by the mana regen attached to her passive, and it was this fantastic design that helped to counter the exact type of situations that people had with her on release, where they were like, oh, I never get to fight her. Oh, all she does is sit on her ally. Yeah, they removed the mana regen from it. All it did from patch 9.14 to 9.24, 20 whole weeks, was provide a shield for 50 to 300 damage. I don't even know how to explain that the shield wasn't the point of the spell. It was cool that you could have a smidge of damage block when you risk yourself for some mana, but if there isn't any mana, why am I gonna risk myself, Riot? In effect, they removed her passive for 6 months, which in and of itself was bad enough for her, but it gave her no reason to dismount or, interact at all in lane. What am I gonna do, Riot? Hop off for my 55 damage auto attack? Oh, I could make my Q worse by throwing it while I'm standing on the ground? Only to get clipped by a Braum Q and die instantly? Yeah, this is fantastic stuff. I'm glad. This is really good. I'm glad they added more reasons for her to not want to press her buttons. Speaking of not pressing buttons, I hope you didn't like controlling missile for very long. They cut a full second off its duration, which is, in MOBAs, like a really long time. A third of its former flight duration, and half of the time it would be empowered. This just gives Yuumi less gameplay. Formerly, because she wasn't walking, she was controlling missile, but now there's just less of that for some reason. Oh, it gets better. They gutted its slow and compensated it by giving, guess what? Damage! The utility support got damage as a buff. Wow, thank you, Riot. That's not overly common in the game or anything. I cannot imagine looking at the queue pre-nerfs and being like, yeah, I think Yuumi has too much to do right now. Let's take away some of the fun from her. Yeah, that's a good change. Speaking of taking away the fun, they removed charges from her E, so she can now only hold one at a time, disincentivizing her from moving around in a fight to double tap heals and buffs. They also gave it a % max mana cost for some reason, like the only one in the entire game, which is weird as hell, as well as lowering its healing and move speed in favor of attack speed. Just like above, when I didn't want to ride tanks anymore because they didn't give me a lot of stats, I don't want to ride on mages now because they don't do anything with the attack speed. Guess who's left on my team that actually wants all of the stats I can provide? Wow, you guessed it, it's my ADC, very cool. They just want me to AFK on the one person and heal them all of the time, because why have anything in her kit that goes anywhere interestingly? Why? Just whatever, man. Get rid of all of it. Who cares, I guess. Lastly, her ulti, which wasn't changed at all. Isn't that cool? But even this is still kind of nerfed because the W changes, leaving her unable to reposition it easily. Before she could jump around and make sure she got that third hit of the root, but now that I'm just duct taped to my ADC all the time, people just walk out of it. It's not that big. I can only pray that this is getting through to you guys, that you're understanding just how every single change in her kit doubled down on making her this boring AFK stat stick that people hated about her on release, rather than leaning into the best parts. They made her into the demon that players didn't want to play with her against. People complained about her being boring and doing nothing, and all of her changes make her not want to do anything and more boring. Jesus Christ! Okay, deep breaths, deep breaths. God, this makes me angry. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This guy is probably just some biased Yuumi player. She's always been really toxic. Riot was just fixing her. And to dispel this, I want to try and explain how I think she got the image that she did and tie that into some of the stats that Riot actually gave us. Okay. One of the tools Riot uses to evaluate champion design in League is what's called the Champion Mastery Curve. It lays out what the average player's win rate is over the number of games they play on that champion, with the intention of showing a visualization of the skill floor, ceiling, and how far apart those are on any particular champion. To break down those terms a little bit, skill floor is the lowest amount of power or input something can have when being played by someone new. Champions like Garen and Annie have really low skill floors, which is why they often get recommended for new players. They're really easy to learn because they are not very complex. Skill ceiling is what the highest level of mastery in something can be. MOBAs, for example, have a really high skill ceiling, meaning that there's a lot to master when playing them. The distance between those two is often a description of how complex that thing is. Tasks that are narrow leave beginners and masters looking the same, whereas tasks that are wide often denote something that takes a long time to learn and master. Here are some of the champion mastery curves for Akali and Qiyana, two generally really high skill assassins. You can see that new players are having a really hard time performing, and so they often lose, whereas veteran players have a really good win rate on her. This is what you'd expect from champions who are generally considered complex like these two. Now here's Neeko and Mordekaiser. Notably, Mordekaiser was really overpowered at the time during these stats were recorded, so he's a bit high up. You can see that they still both maintain these mastery curves, but they're much shallower, both generally being simpler champions to pick up and learn. Now, think about it. Think about Yuumi. Where do you think she'll fall closer to? Easy to learn and shallow, or complex and hard to learn? Well, hopefully if you've been paying attention, you'll have guessed correctly. Her mastery curve on release mimicked that of some of the most complex assassins in the entire game. The Haha AFK champion had a 35% win rate on new players, the people most likely to not fully understand her kit yet, and got all the way up to a 98.9% pick and ban with a 72% win rate in LCS during the season of her release. We start to get a bit of an understanding here. People saw that she was performing really, really well at high levels, but they didn't quite understand what about her kit let her do that. So when they picked this champion up for the first time themselves, they realized that she has a really low skill floor, and they go, she must just be overpowered, she can go AFK. She had a really low skill floor that made her really easy to pick up, and a really high skill ceiling that allowed her to be mastered. Like, I clearly understand that probably her gap was a bit too wide and she needed some adjusting to help, curb the fact that she was dominating competitive play and people learning her were basically just feeding their games. But I don't think that, kneecapping her skill ceiling to the point of, nearly not existing anymore was the right move. Had Riot just given her more time and let the memes die off as more players get a grasp on her, while, lowering her numbers just a bit until the item rework could come through to, truly bring some balance back to utility supports, I think she would be just as fun today as she was on release. Instead, we're left with this disgraced shadow of Yuumi, unable to do what she was designed to do, forlorn to AFK on her ADC while pressing E off cooldown, the worst possible fate I can imagine. Maybe, just maybe, someone at Riot will hear the pleas of Yuumi fans and will address her kit for the better. I just, want to be able to play support again, man. God, I really liked her. It's really lame. Oh well. And I suppose that's video number 2 done. Sorry for making it take so long to come out. This wasn't actually gonna be video number 2. I was working on the Omori video instead for number 2, but it was a lot harder to write about than I thought, so that's still in the works. And this script went through a full rewrite after I had started recording it and realized it was bad, so that ended up taking a lot longer than I thought it would be. Oops. Luckily, the next one should be coming out pretty soon, relatively speaking, obviously, because about half to 2/3 of the script is already written, and that'll be on Beat Saber and the flow state. Definitely a little more academic than this one. I'm going to be leaning a lot into the research. So that's what I'm doing right now, is mostly academic research for that one. Yeah, so, the like, the subscribe, the comment. Tell me I'm horribly mistaken, that Yuumi's really bad and you dislike her. Put that in the comments. It'll make the algorithm happy or something, because comments are good. And with that, have a great day.